My name's Adam, and I'm a writer and filmmaker who specialises, amongst other things, in what we now call folk horror, which is a very strange, surreal subgenre of film, television, literature, and lots of other types of media, which has become very prominent in post-millennial art. Now, folk horror is not something which is a product of this period. It is most famous for being most virulent during the era of the counterculture in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Now, the term folk horror first came to real prominence in 2010 when the legal gentleman, actor, writer, director Mark Gatiss used the term in his documentary series looking at horror film called A History of Horror. Now, in that particular episode looking at 1970s British horror, he canonized the initial three films of the genre, now commonly known as the Unholy Trinity. That's Michael Reeves' Witchfinder General, Piers Haggard's Blood on Satan's Claw, and Robin Hardy's The Wicker Man. Now, folk horror extends far beyond these three films. It is particularly a theme that is noticeable in children's television from the same period, and especially on the BBC in the 1970s, but also in various different drama strands such as Play for Today and other strange sort of televisual anomalies which occur during this period. Now, partly for political reasons, the genre is now once again extremely popular, more popular than it has probably ever been, apart from in this post sort of counterculture period. And there are various reasons for this, and one of them is the director of the film you're about to watch, Ben Wheatley. Now, Ben Wheatley was not always a director associated with folk horror. He first came to prominence when directing television, and his first feature film, Down Terrace, was mainly a very sort of Alan Clarke style gritty gangster film. It's not until 2011 when he makes Kill List that the obvious influence of the Unholy Trinity and various other bits of folk horror sort of come to prominence.
Your privy parts are doomed, homunculus! Come here!
Now, folk horror has a number of key themes, various occult and pagan practices, devil worship, various elements of folklore, especially English folklore, but mainly the one factor which is often in every example in some way of folk horror is an emphasis on the more eerie and isolating aspect of the landscape. Now, from the title of the film, A Feild in England, that is going to be pretty obvious as a key theme. But where A Feild in England differs from the original folk horror is that it is also extremely referential to other films and cinema. Now, when Michael Reeves made Witchfinder General and when Piers Haggard made The Blood on Satan's Claw, they were reacting to a very strong social consciousness of returning to more folkloric practices, more folkloric thematic material. This is evident in the music made from that period by bands like Steel Eye Span, Pentangle, and even bands like Pink Floyd with songs like Grantchester Meadows. There's a return to a very uncanny version of the rural, whereas Wheatley's film is equally about those films as it is about those same themes. More so than perhaps the earlier batch of folk horror films, which were largely a reaction to counterculture ideals and the Heath era government, Wheatley's film is very much, and his whole filmography for that matter, is a reaction to the politics of 2010 to 2015 and henceforth. Now, this is most evident in Kill List, which is very much a film about class and about the ravaging of the working class communities and the almost abuse and taking advantage of working class people. Now, A Feild in England is slightly different in this sense because it is questioning ideas of nationality, but it's also questioning them through some very ambiguous and hallucinogenic ideas. It's a very difficult film to spoil in this sense because there are multiple readings of what actually happens. It follows the apprentice of an alchemist, Whitehead, who, escaping a battle in English Civil War, finds himself trapped with several others in a field. Now, they are in search of something which the alchemist he works for has said and researched to be buried in this field. And the zone of the field becomes very what Michel Foucault would call a heterotopia. It is far more of a concept than a place. And when this happens in film, and especially folk horror, that is often a gateway to its more horrific elements.
The coward is here.
Now, Wheatley has been on record of his influence on this film from many examples of folk horror. And there's some quotes here from an interview he did for Uncut magazine in the period of the film's release, which kind of shows how indebted he is to many films now recognised in the canon of folk horror. So he says, things like Children of the Stones and The Owl Service I came to as an adult, being more interested in getting into folk horror. When I was a kid, I grew up in Essex next to some woods, and I always had nightmares about the woods and things that would happen to you in the woods. There was something going on there, definitely. I remember finding all these strange bottles and stuff. It was real blood on Satan's claws stuff. Now, he mentions Children of the Stones and The Owl Service, two series designed for a young adult audience, and yet they are influencing a film which, as you'll see later on, becomes incredibly violent and visceral. And this is kind of one of the stranger aspects of folklore, and to an extent what we call hauntology, where we look back at the popular culture of the 1970s in Britain in particular and find it to be a shocking place where horror was deemed acceptable for a younger audience. This is most obvious in what we now call the public information films, such as The Spirit of Dark and Lonely Water and various films about the dangers of pylons. There was something in the water that was both esoteric but also disturbingly domestic. With a lot of folk horror is also about isolation, the isolation of communities, and A Feild in England is no different in its sense. And Wheatley is pretty adamant about this not just being a folk horror film, but actually a film in a long line of isolated cinema narratives. Now, he lists a number of influences in this sense as well, where he suggests Alan Clarke's Contact to be a huge influence on this film. Now, Contact is a film about British soldiers in the Troubles in Ireland, and they're isolated in various rural fields. And I don't think that there's a director who's had more influence on Wheatley even before the folk horror stuff kicks in than Alan Clarke. Now, Alan Clarke also dipped his toe into folk horror, most famously for a Play for Today episode called Pender's Fen, written by David Rudkin. And I think overall, the similarities between Clarke's work and Wheatley's work are the most stark and most obvious.
What do you see, friend?
Nothing. Perhaps.
Feild in England is therefore probably the strongest of folk horror examples of the period we are currently in, and Wheatley simply cannot switch off the influence of this very powerful and very raw subgenre of film. As O'Neill suggests to Whitehead, you cannot escape the field, and I think overall this is an apt summation of Wheatley's filmmaking as a whole. Enjoy the film, it's cracking.